All right. Okay. We are on. Okay, people logged in. Perfect. Okay, well, I hope everything is good for you in Vietnam. And so, second session. We're getting my papers ready. There. All right, so to this evening, we'll move on where we left off yesterday. Now, if you remember correctly, we had gone over the explanation of the legal system, the framework, how it functions, trying to have a general outlook, an overview of the different legal systems and the international connection, and we'll go into more details today. We had a few words on the relationship between the institutions, the institutional arrangement, and what we call development. And remember what I said when I'm talking about development here, I'm talking generally, globally, about how societies meet both economic growth and what we usually call social development, which relates to all the other parts of life that are not directly concerned by economics. So that would be, health, education, well-being, what the United Nations index calls well-being. And there's an index of human well-being. And when I talk about development, and when we look at the relationship between your rules, your laws, and development, there is a common view today that you have to look at all the different aspects of life. It's not only about economics. Of course, in this class, we are focusing, obviously, on the economic side of things. And even within economics, we'll of course, be looking at business, especially when we'll be talking about ethics, but we will be focusing, as we go along, more on the financial aspects. So the financial industry. And so this brings us to this third part of this, the first, let's say, chapter of the lectures. Remember, the first chapter is about rules and regulation explained. And tonight, we're going to focus on two aspects. We're going to focus on what we call the international convergence on financial regulation, because that's a very important background of what we'll be looking at. And it is a good area to understand exactly how things fall in place and how then compliance and ethics blend in terms of methods. We'll also be looking to the two parts tonight at who designs the norms and the standards, both at the national level and at the international level, because this will help us understand more specifically the development of compliance. All right, so that's the program. And I insist, I know it's not that easy online. It's not much fun for you nor for me. Do not hesitate to ask questions, to come in, use the live chat, or if you want to speak out, please do not hesitate. I'll be very happy for any interaction. All right. So once I've said this, let's look at what we mean by international convergence of financial regulation. International convergence of financial regulation is a way to insist on the fact that they are convergence of the way national system organize their financial industry, their financial regulation. And This is going to be an interesting issue when we look at compliance and at ethics, because one of the elements that is not necessarily always problematic, but that raises question, is about the universality or not of ethical views. And so here we're going to look at something that is maybe sometimes a bit complex. Why? Because you have to understand that although there is an international conversion of financial regulation, meaning that we are going to witness the same types of regulations in different systems regarding finance, there are still great differences in how they are actually implemented or how people actually enforce those regulations, how they behave. And so we are going to be confronted with a mix of international standards, common standards that we share across economics, at the same time, very local or culturally embedded behaviors, and cutting across all this, the actual demand, first of compliance, and second of an ethical questioning about the behaviors. Okay, so we'll be seeing that there are different levels that mix. Now, coming back to something very, very simple. Okay, how do we organize the financial industry? In most countries, there is today what I would call a common scheme of financial regulation. What I mean by that is that if you look on the paper, okay, if you look in the books at how the financial markets, the financial industries are regulated in different parts of the world, you realize that there is a common scheme. And that common scheme is more precisely to be found when you look at the 3 levels of financial regulation. Or to say it differently, when you look at the different elements that structure the rules and regulations that are applied to finance, you do find a very common scheme. Why? Because in all systems, you have this tripartite input. First, the first sets of rules that will apply to financial regulation are not specifically financial rules, but are what we call the national common law. Now, the national common law, and I'm not here referring to British common law, I'm just referring to the general laws of a given country. The national common or general laws are the laws that are related to contracts, to civil procedures, to bankruptcy, to all these, to company law. Each national system has its own sets of rules. And of course, financial services, they take place within those regulations. Why? Because if I'm a Vietnamese financial institution, that means I am following Vietnamese company law. And the contracts that I conclude will, of course, have to meet the requirements of the Vietnamese contract law. If I'm a French company, a French bank, well, I have to do that under French law. So there's this first level of rules that is very national, that is composed and that is constituted of the national general laws. The second layer of specific, and now we're going towards more specifically finance-related rules. So the second layer are the specific financial laws. For example, the national banking laws, the investment services law, the insurance laws. So you have the Vietnamese banking laws, you have the French banking laws, the US, etc., etc. The US is a bit more complicated, by the way, because the United States of America, and not the only, India also, for example, these are federal states. And so you always have to keep in mind that in a federal state, you have federal rules, and then you have state rules. And depending on the local mix, banking regulation, for example, will be national or not. Okay, so even in federal states, it can be more complex because here again, you have to distinguish different levels. But basically, and I'll focus more on unitarian states, okay, like Vietnam, like France, Italy, those places. Germany is a federation also, for example. Now, you have specific local laws related to finance. Okay, so basically the banking regulation, investment services, and insurance law. These three sectors, banking, investment, insurance, together they make up what we call financial services. Okay, the financial services industry is composed of banking activities, investment services activity, and insurance activities. But they all meet together on one point. It's that the three different types of activities, because obviously the business of banks is not the business of investment services. Now, of course, a bank can also carry out investment services, commercial, activities, but in that case, that will be separated from the purely banking activities. So there are different rules. The point here we have to keep in mind is that there are different rules depending on the nature of the service. But they all blend in what we call the financial services industry, and they do have a common point, is that these three different types of activities, they are responsible for something that is common, which is called systemic risk. Whether a banking institution, an investment services institution, or an insurance company, all of them pose a threat to the economy because they deal in money, which is a very sensitive issue, and the failure of an institution could have very far-reaching effects, what we call systemic risk. Basically, what we mean by that is that the failure of a garment in a factory will not threaten the whole of the economy. The failure of a major financial institution can trigger what we call a domino effect, the systemic risk effect, and that can bring down, of course, all of the financial industry and have repercussions and have consequences on the what we call the real economy, on the industry, the business, and all that. And so what brings together these three different financial sector is the systemic risk. And so that is why we both talk of a common approach regarding systemic risk for the financial services industry, while we at the same time have separate rules and regulation for the different activities, banking, investment, insurance. So that's the second layer. The second layer is specific to the financial services. And that sector is also national. Okay, for example, in Vietnam, it is the Vietnamese banking, Vietnamese investment services, etc. And then we have a third layer or third element of the regulation. It's what we call the agency and the agency model. Now, this is very important because the agency model is very specific, initially is very specific to finance. And it is an element that we will have to have in mind, because compliance and even ethics, although I'm not going to talk about ethics right now, but compliance is quite profoundly impacted by the agency model. And we will see why as we go along. But so in the convergence of the financial regulation is that across the world, in different countries, you find national rules, national general law rules that will apply, specific financial laws that will apply, and then agencies that have a very specific mission to overview, to control, and to potentially sanction the financial industry, and so the economic operators in those industries. Now, as I said, these three elements together that are commonly used across the world are national. But what is specific about finance, and that we'll see that more precisely just after, but what is specific about finance is that the second layer, the specific financial laws, they are very heavily influenced by international, let's say, consensus, not necessarily international state treaties, but a consensus. I'm sure you're familiar with what we call the Basel Committee. Okay, it's called the BCSB, the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision. The BCBS, sorry, not the BCSB, the BCBS, or the Financial Stability Board, the FSB, which is something that was set up under the IMF as a supervision. They issue a lot of literature on financial regulation. So they issue non-mandatory standards, and that's soft law, as we talked about it yesterday, and sorry, the day before. And so these are just recommendations, guidelines. But these guidelines are decided upon, debated at an international level in group work that bring together people from different parts of the world. And they issue guidelines that are then used by states, but it's the state's responsibility that is totally free to follow those guidelines or not, of course. But because of the interconnection of financial markets, now for at least 50 years, a highly interconnected financial markets, globally speaking, most states do pay a lot of attention to these guidelines. And these guidelines, you have to understand, they are also elaborated with the participation of all the national agencies. And so, for example, at the Basel Committee or at the IMF group works, you have representatives of the national agency that exchange their views. And that is why there's a very dynamic, interactive flow of ideas and of debates going back and forth at the national, international level. That's why it's a complex area. But that also explains why there is a convergence. There is a convergence because at the international level, in the financial industry, there are lots of exchange of points of view, of analysis, and the regulatory agencies try to find consensus and to follow not similar rules, but let's say rules that converge, that are not incompatible. And that is also a condition of the efficiency of the international financial market. So that is why understanding that there's a common scheme of financial regulation is important. Regarding the agency model we will be seeing later on even more in detail the concept of the agency principle theory. Okay, so when we'll be looking at corporate governance, we will be looking at what is called the agency principle problem and theory. There's a theory to address that. The agency model was initially, to a certain extent, originated probably in the Northern American way of doing things, but today has been replicated in all countries. The idea of an agency is the following. You have an organization that will exercise state powers, but that is not the state. That is independent from the administrative organization of the state. It is not, of course, and this is very important, it's not independent in the sense that it would be autonomous from the state, okay? But it's independent from the administrative organization of the state. And this is important for qualitative reasons and for efficiency reasons. Qualitative reasons, it's this idea that finance needs to be governed not only by politics. Okay, so of course, agencies will follow the dominant political choices that are made at the state, of course. But it's important that the regulation of finance is shielded, or at least is a bit protected from the political interventions. Okay, so that's one of the reasons. The other reason why agencies are independent organization from the administrative organization of the state, it's because financial services require an agile approach. This is a sector where there's a lot of innovation, where things go pretty fast. And so an administrative organization, and we know states, okay, we know administrative organizations lack the agility usually. And when I say they lack the agility, you have to understand, I'm a Frenchman, and French people are accustomed to strong administration. And then I think that relates to Vietnam. So when I say that administrations are not agile, I'm not saying administrations are necessarily bad. That would be a very Chicago School of Economics approach, a very neoliberal American view. That is not how we see it. But what we do know, and what we are aware of, for example, speaking from a French perspective, is that administration is quite big, has to follow sets of rules that does not enable it to be sufficiently reactive, sufficiently agile, confronted with the reality of financial markets. Okay, so that's why the agency model is also a model that was invented or imagined so that it would be more efficient. And that is why the first element of an agency model is that it's an organization that exercises state powers by delegation of the state, but that is independent from the administrative organization of the state. Now, this is important because it is linked with one of the third bullet point that you have here, the stakeholder participation. We also know that administration have a top-down approach to life problems, economics or whatever. And this top-down approach is normal because that's the way administrations function. They are very hierarchical in organization. And so this top-down approach is considered as not being the most efficient way to regulate some fast-moving sectors of activity. And that is why the stakeholder participations within agency means that the following organization is usually put in place. The agency has representatives from the public authority, but it also has, as members of that agency, representatives of the economic operators. And so the model here is less of a top-down than, it's not a purely bottom-up, but it's less of a top-down approach, and it is more of a collaborative approach. It means that at the agency level, and I'll give you an example of a couple agencies. The French AMF, what we call the Autorité des Marchés Financiers, which is the Financial Markets Authority. We have also one at the European level. In the US, it's, for example, the SEC, okay, the Securities Exchange Commission is an agency. But there are also, for example, central banks. Central banks are considered legally as agencies because they are independent. They're not autonomous, of course, but they're independent. They carry out the monetary policy. They report, of course, to the parliament or the executive, depends of the local organization. But they have a very clear mandate to be in charge of that policy. But the stakeholder approach means that these agencies will be very close and will understand very well what's happening on the markets, because you have participants of that market that are sitting side by side with the representative of the states. And so what this means is that we're trying to have an organization that can react with a very good knowledge of what is happening on the market. So that's one of also the reason of the agency model. But of course, the agency, and I insist on that, it's independent, but it's not autonomous. It has a delegation of the state's powers. And so the powers of the agencies, they come from the state. Okay, so it's not a private, the agency is not a private actor. Okay. What is the role of the agency? It has three functions, and these functions, we will see how they're related directly with compliance after. First, the agencies, they set norms, they set rules. They set rules at the industry level. Okay, they do not set the general rules of the country, but they set the specific rules that will apply. That's the first function. So it has a bit like a legislative function. The second function of an agency is monitoring. And this is where the compliance will play an important role. Monitoring the operators, the economic operators. For example, central banks will monitor banks. The Financial Services Authority will monitor investment services. And usually you have an agency for the insurance sector that will monitor the behavior and that will check on the compliance of the insurance companies. So the monitoring aspect is important because it means that it is the agency that supervises the private actors or all of the actors on a given sector, in our case, financial regulation. So it creates standards, norms, which is a legislative type of power. It monitors the behavior of the economic operators, and that's a bit like of an executive type of power. And finally, these agencies have the power to sanction misbehavior of the economic operators. And that is a bit like a judicial system, except it's not a judge. The agency is an agency. And so then usually the sanction that is decided by the agency can be challenged in front of a court. But they have the power to sanction the misbehavior of economic operator. And so you see the link between compliance and ethics, even before we've looked at what exactly are compliance and ethics. But you see the link. Because through the monitoring and the sanction, the agency will play an important role in shaping the compliance that firms have to follow, and in deciding what are the boundaries, what are the limits, what is the framework of the ethical positions that companies and economic operator have to follow. So that's a first element to understand. Talking about financial regulation is this common scheme of financial regulation, because basically what I've talked about right now is something that you could witness in any legal system. It doesn't mean, and I insist on that, it doesn't mean that it will be identically organized and that the content of the rules will be exactly the same in different countries, but the framework is basically the same that you find in all countries. No. When we talk about financial regulation, we also have to understand that there's been a radical change after 2007, 2008, after the last financial crisis. And after the G20 adopted a set of consensus on what was the objective of financial regulation in today's world, in today's globalized world. And so today, when we talk about financial regulation, and that's why you will see that compliance is fundamental in order to make this work and hold together. In today's world, we consider that financial regulation have to embed a comprehensive long-term approach to regulation. Okay. Of course, in 2008, well, just after 2008, 2009, 2010, there was a lot of what we call emergency response to meet the problems of the crisis. Sorry, my emails are on. I'll just switch them off. There. So just after the crisis, there was a lot of emergency response. But you can make a parallel to what is happening today in the wake of the COVID-19 situation. Last year, when the pandemic hit the world very quickly, when it decided to leave Wuhan and to go everywhere, that the first reaction of states, and Vietnam, for example, was a state that reacted very quickly, very efficiently, immediately, as well as Taiwan, South Korea, other states. It's a different story. But what's interesting is that the first period, let's say from February, January 2020 up till maybe the summer of last year, states were in an emergency mode. They were trying to fight a fire. Okay. In today's world, of course, we cannot say that the COVID-19 is something new. Okay. And so this has legal consequences. We cannot say it's something new. We are seeing states and organizations of states, regulation evolve. Why? Because now we are more looking at what are the long-term implications of the pandemic, what are the types of rules, regulation, choices that we should make either at the state level or at the international level in order to deal with something that is not just an emergency now that is part of common life. Okay. And so that's exactly the same thing that happened in finance. In finance, there was in 2009, 2010, 11, these emergency response, but they were laying down the foundation for then a move towards more, let's say, renewed regulation that should adopt a comprehensive long-term approach to the issues of finance. Now, that it might seem obvious for you, but that was a real change from the pre-financial crisis period. From the pre-financial crisis period, most of the financial industry was focusing on short-term economic issues. In today's world of finance and in the financial regulation, we see how the long-term implication of the financial activity has to be taken into account within the rules that apply to these activities. And this will have important consequences And we'll explain also partly why the ethical aspects have actually taken so much importance in today's world. Okay? It is because of the fact that ethical views are the natural complement of an efficient regulatory response. Okay, or to say it differently, ethical questioning actually complements, adds to the efficiency of the laws that apply to a given sector. The other point I'd like to make regarding the financial regulation is the fact that when we talk about financial regulation, have in mind that we have here a multi-dimensional perspective. Financial regulation is not just and solely about banks or about investment services. It brings together a set of separate elements that it blends in order to offer what would be the financial regulation. And so when by saying this, if we look a bit more in detail, you realize that financial regulation, first of all, touches upon, and that's obvious because that's the core, okay, capital requirements of banks. And that's the Basel agreement. We know that at one point, the capital requirement became, and it was a general consensus, became something that we had to focus on because it was a requirement in order to try to limit the systemic risk. Okay. So capital requirements are definitely part of financial regulation. The accounting and tax rules play an important role also. I will not be going into much details regarding accounting and tax, but it's obvious that they play a role. Think about some of the accounting rules, especially when you look at IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, and what the last financial crisis has shown is that some of these standards, some of these IFRS standards, actually played a role in the crisis, a bit like pouring oil on the fire. Okay, so that is something that now is part of financial regulation, and what we try, what most legislators or agency try to do is say, what will be the impact of a specific accounting standard on systemic risk or on the functioning of the financial institutions. Other aspect that's important, I will not talk about it, but it's obviously important, competition. There's increased competition within the financial industry for at least two reasons. One is because of globalization. It means that you have more actors that are competing on connected markets. Okay, so there's more competition, but also within a national economy, even within a national economy, you will have competition. For example, banks will probably enter into the investment service industry, and so you have competition also among the different local players. And you have to add to this a new type of competition that is linked to what we call the fintechs, the financial tech companies. So these are companies, usually startups, that come up with new ways of delivering financial services. And that creates a new competition. And you see how all this has to be looked at on a regulatory basis. Financial safety nets, that's an important aspect. It's the collateral. It's how do you organize the activities so that you limit the risk. Corporate governance of the financial institutions. Initially, it wasn't much of an issue. It has become a fundamental aspect. And corporate governance is directly linked to compliance. Both work together in order to make sure that financial institutions are governed in the best possible way. So that's what we'll be focusing on, corporate governance. Now, we'll be focusing on corporate governance in the financial industry, but corporate governance exists in all firms. The money laundering aspects, I won't go into any details here, but we will be talking about them a bit. Why? Because of ethics, because of compliance, corporate governance, and ethics. Money laundering, you're going to have rules, very specific rules, but you're going to have a lot of gray areas, okay? Areas where maybe what you want to do is perfectly valid, is absolutely what we call legitimate. It's legally valid, but it raises ethical issues. And so there's a direct correlation or link, maybe not a correlation, but a link between taking into account ethical questioning, money laundering, and corruption issues. And when you're looking at the financial sector, obviously this is where there's a concentration of money laundering risks and of corruption. And so that is why in today's understanding of financial regulation, all the money laundering and all the rules to fight against corruption are part of that, of the overall financial regulation. And that is why it's going to be important. We're going to be looking at ethics, is to try to understand how that plays a role in governing the institutions and in making decisions. Because at the end of the day, the real, if not problem, but the real issue is for management and top management of a financial institution to be able to decide on what decision will they make. Do they go into this contract? Do they put on the market a new financial product? And they have to take into account those ethical and compliance aspects in making their decision. And finally, the structures of the organization. I wrote here banking structures, but we could actually have a larger view in saying financial institution structures. And we will see that the financial regulation actually sets requirements on how you run your company, how you organize it. And one of those is, for example, one of those requirements is to have a compliance officer, to have a compliance department. Okay, and that is something that we will see. Now, that is not true to all industry. Okay, in some industries, there are no specific guidelines on how you organize your company. In financial services, in financial activities, financial institutions have to be organized following specific requirements that are legal requirements. And one of those legal requirements is just the fact that you need to have people that are in charge of compliance. So that's something we will see extensively after. So you see, when we talk about financial regulation, we're talking about something that is pretty large in scope. And so because of that, that can be seen or perceived as complex. And finally, the last point I want to make here on this international convergence of financial regulation is the fact that the long-run economic goals are now very high up on the agenda. As I said earlier, before the crisis, the last financial crisis, basically short-term decision and short-term considerations were the standard. One of the interesting things that's happening in the world today, and that was before the COVID-19 situation, but the COVID-19 situation, the pandemic, is accelerating that change and that evolution, is that we're moving away short-term consideration to embrace more and more long-run economic goals, long-run social development goals. Okay, so I think that's very important. And obviously, financial regulation today takes that into account. All right, so that's what we have when we talk about the international convergence. Is that those are the elements that you basically find in all countries. In a nutshell, and I'll be quick on this, and then I will explain a bit more in a bit more detail the evolution over time. But in a nutshell, when we talk about effective and efficient financial regulation today, there is basically a consensus on what is needed, not necessarily on the answers, okay? Not necessarily on how you deal with the problems, but on what is needed, there is a consensus. This consensus came out of the observations of the market changes of the last decades, last 2 to 3 decades, that have seen tremendous changes in structures and operations of the financial market. And these changes, they relate to a set of observation that are still quite relevant for today. These changes can be let's say summarized in a series of high-level topics. First of all, improvements. Okay, maybe the term improvement can be debated, but I'll call it improvement. Improvements in technology. Here again, the radical change in the use of new technologies, in how new technologies changes the way we can do things. And when I'm, for example, talking about compliance, a compliance-based model today, internal model, will rely heavily on new technology and on algorithm types of programs, on a set of automated programs, and that has really radically changed the way we carry out business, the way we organize business. It has brought with itself new risks, but also new tools to answer those risks. So the improvements of technology, that is one of the first driver of these tremendous market changes. Second thing that was witnessed over the past decades was the very rapid, sometimes, and some people will say excessively rapid, product innovation on the markets. That is something that still exists. Think about, for example, today, blockchain, ICOs, okay, initial coin offering. These are product innovation. So the blockchain is not a product, of course. The blockchain is a technology, and the blockchain in itself is not really innovative in terms of technology. It's just, I mean, the technologies that we use in blockchain have been in use for a long time, for some time at least. But it's the combination of these different bits of technology together to create what we call the blockchain that is new, okay, obviously. And with the blockchain, there are new types of products that are coming on the market. What we call the crypto assets, cryptocurrencies, and things like that. So rapid product innovation, rapid financial product innovation is something that has also pushed for major changes in the markets. And that, of course, then called for new regulations. The integration aspects of finance and financial market, what we call globalization, I talked about it already. It's very important because globalization, as you well know, brings with it different ways of looking at things and different risk, different regulatory response, and basically globalization changes the nature of the game. Okay, international banking is not national banking. Okay, the opportunities and the risk and the constraints are just not the same. So that is also an important element of the evolution of the financial markets. With that came, of course, competition, and competition plays a fundamental role today in financial service, which was not the case before, which was not the case 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, let's say 50 years ago. Financial services were basically national, so you could have had competition nationally, but it was not at the level of the competition that exists today. Why do I mention this? I mention this because, first of all, we will see that there are some ethical concerns regarding competition. And also because competition touches upon compliance in the sense that compliance can be a tool to favor or to limit competition, and we'll see that. Or to say it differently, we will see how common compliance requirements are an element of the level playing field that enables competition to happen in a positive way, or in a hopefully positive way. So there's a link here between the increase of competition in financial regulation and the way we use and structure compliance. And finally, another driver of these radical changes, of these tremendous market changes, were the policy and regulatory reforms that were witnessed in every state. Basically, all states have adopted reforms. If you take the last 30 to 40 years, I cannot imagine, maybe North Korea, but I can't imagine many states I cannot imagine one state that hasn't, to some degree or another, reformed its financial regulations. So this also is a driver of these changes of the financial regulation. The other element that is now clearer is the combination of supervision and regulation. Why? Because, as I told you, and as we talked about yesterday, traditional law is more related to what we call hard law and to regulation. Okay, laws, decrees, and all that. Soft law is a mechanism where you have more guidelines. Now, this is very important to understand, because compliance, as well as the ethical concerns, they fall under soft law. Okay, to give you a clearer example, because this is a bit abstract, a clearer example of soft versus hard law. Imagine the rules for driving and for driving a car, for example. Hard law is, for example, the rule that you have that says when the light goes red at a crossing, at a street crossing, you have to stop. It's mandatory. That's hard law. The soft law is, for example, in the French rules. So I don't know if that exists in Vietnam, so I'll take the French example. In the French driving rules, you have a rule that says that the driver has to master the speed of his vehicle at all time. Okay. Now that's a soft law approach. Why? Because the rule is not telling you you have to drive at 50 kilometers an hour and you cannot go over 70. It's not telling you that. It's telling you you have to meet an objective. You have to master the speed of your vehicle because you have to be able to control your vehicle at all time. That would be the soft law approach. This is also the difference that you find between what is called a principle-based rule, okay, and a rule-based system. The rule-based system is when you have a rule that says you can do this and that, but not this. The principle-based is when the rule is telling you you have to meet a target, you have to meet an objective. That's exactly what compliance is about. Okay, so that's what we're going to be. We'll see more in more details. Is how compliance functions. Compliance will embed a mix of hard law. For example, in France or in Vietnam, you also, I know that you have that same rule. You have the hard law rules for financial institutions that make it mandatory to have a compliance officer, compliance department or organization, compliance procedures. That's hard law. But then the content of that compliance can be just through principle-based type of rules rather than hard law. So the mix of both, there's a general consensus that we need a mix of both today in order to give a coherent and efficient framework for financial institutions. And finally, the two last points, and I'll be very quick on that, are the systemic issues. I've already talked about these what we call systematic issues, especially the financial risk that financial institutions pose to an economy, and the incentive issues. There's a lot, and this is where ethics and compliance plays an important role. There's a large consensus today on the fact that it is impossible to have very precise rule-based approach for all of the behavior of the economic operators. That's why you need to have incentives. You have to incentivize them, and then it is the private actors, the operators, the economic operators, that will make the best choice, but you need to incentivize them. So, for example, if you want to limit, to fight against money laundering, of course you're going to adopt rules. For example, the KYC requirement, know your customer, which is also a way to fight against money laundering. There's an incentive. You incentivize the operators to carry out a screening of the clients rather than just follow a very precise set of standards, because it is the operator that has a better understanding of what is happening. So what the crisis has revealed, and that is why we move toward this understanding of what is needed for effective and efficient financial regulation. What you have to understand is that the financial crisis of 2007-2008 has actually highlighted the fact that there were a lot of shortcomings in terms of practices carried out by financial institutions. Okay, what we call inappropriate and ill-adapted practices. The question of were the concept that we used in order to understand the regulation before the crisis were inadapted. Basically, we know today that the concepts were not really the problem. It's how they were put into practice that was the problem. It's how the monitoring of these services and of these activities was carried out that was the problem. So to say it differently, and then you'll see why the importance of compliance, it's because there was a poor compliance. And sometimes there was poor compliance simply because the rules were not adapted or were not clear enough or were not sufficiently incentive-based. And so they missed out. They missed a lot of the issues of the real life and the market activities issues. What the crisis has also shown was that your regulation in itself could create risk. So that's this is where we stand today in terms of effective and efficient financial regulation, and it explains, it justifies the fact that both ethical considerations and compliance has become one of the major pillar of financial regulation. Okay, and that is a radical change. Now, it might be obvious for you, but it's a radical change if you take just 15 years ago. Okay. Now, just a bit of history, not much, but just a bit of history so that you understand the general context. And here I would say in terms of general understanding of the functioning of the financial market and of the economic theories behind that. If we take a historical vision of how things evolved, before the 1990s, yeah, and this is something you have to understand, before the 1990s, there was a lot of, or there were basically mainly state regulation. But before the 1990s, most of the markets were still, not exclusively, of course, but were predominantly national. And it was the states, the national states, that would regulate the activities. Part of the economic theory that existed at that time, that was mainstream at that time, was the fact that it was the state that would create the rules that would be applied on markets. So up to the 1980s, we have mainly state regulation, and we are mainly concerned with national markets. This will change in the 1980s. It changes in the 1980s basically because it is the time where you have a prime minister in Great Britain called Margaret Thatcher, that is a liberal, that's convinced that neoliberalism is the only way to deliver growth and to improve the situation. And at the same time, in the U.S., you have a man called Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan becomes the president of the U.S., and he is a convinced, of course, liberal. Why? Because at that time, in the 1980s, the Chicago School of Economics theories become mainstream, become dominant. They influence all of the policymakers. And so what's specific about the Chicago School of Economics is that it is a school that is profoundly averse to states. It doesn't believe in state regulation. It considers that any state intervention is necessarily less efficient than market mechanism. Now, this is highly debatable, and the good thing about the 2008 financial crisis is that it has, of course, questioned that those approaches and those mantra. But try to imagine, in the 1980s up till the years 2000, there was this dominant, common understanding, common wisdom, as conventional wisdom, as we mentioned the other day, that you should limit state regulation. What should you put in place? You should put what is called supervision. Supervision by independent authorities, the agencies. And see how the different bits and pieces fall together to explain today's framework. So supervision was the way forward, and you needed to enhance, develop, and promote a compliance review based on technical aspects. Okay, the compliance that operators were to implement and that the agency were to supervise was technical in nature, a technical compliance. That this will change after the 2008 financial crisis. The focus will change. We haven't abandoned technical compliance, and we'll see that, but the focus is not anymore on technical compliance, because that has not prevented the crisis. It did not have the capacity to prevent the crisis. So supervision is the method that becomes popular and mainstream, and that is implemented in all the states at that time. At the same time, because of the Chicago School of Economics teaching, self-regulation is promoted. Okay, self-regulation, saying that, well, private actors have to regulate themselves because they will do it in a much more efficient manner than the state will. For a very simple reason. The operators have a better understanding of what they're doing, of the risk on their related to their activities than an outsider like the state. So self-regulation became the mantra, and as I told you, the Chicago School of Economics hates the state, and so deregulation was also the major, or at least a major focus at that time. Now, deregulation, you have to understand the word deregulation. It doesn't mean no regulation. It doesn't mean no rules. It means that the rules are different. They rely heavily on soft law and on agency models rather than the state. Okay, that's what deregulation means. So you move away from strict state rules-based systems to more principle-based systems that are governed and disciplined by competition and by agencies. During that period, the focus is also, in terms of level, is also put at the firm level. Okay, there's a focus on microeconomics. The great focus from the 1980s up till the early 2000s is on the functioning of the institutions, and the financial institution, of course, in first place. Not at the market level. So what's interesting is that the regulation at that point only looked and is only concerned with imposing rules for the organization and the functioning of the firm, but doesn't really look at the consequences of the act of these individual firms together and what that would have in terms of impact on the market, which would be a market level focus, and in this case, a macroeconomic approach. This is one of the reasons why a lot of, we headed straight into the crisis without really seeing any warning signals, because we were focusing only at the firm level and not enough at the macro level. Now, just before the crisis, actually, there was a lot of initiatives to change that, but it came too late. I mean, the elements of the crisis were already there. Now, what's also specific about that period, the period that's here, so there's a change in economic thinking. There's a firm level focus, and it is also the period where transnational activities takes off and grows quite a lot. Okay, there's an extreme and very rapid pace of the development of globalization, especially in finance during that period. And so we move away from national market to transnational activities. But this also explains why this made sense, because if you have an increase in transnational activity, then state regulation is not efficient, because states can only, because of the sovereignty of states and of each state, a state regulation can only apply to the state territory. If the activities are carried out across territories, then we need another way to regulate those activities, because state regulation will not be efficient. And so that also explains why supervision, self-regulation, and deregulation were accepted as the best way forward. Actually, it was the best way towards the crisis, okay? Because we were lacking, something was missing in that answer. And that is what the 2008 financial crisis revealed. And the changes that came with that, first, the focus goes from firm level to market level, okay? A lot of the new rules, or at least concern that were set forward, are related to market level supervision and focus. For example, the creation of the Financial Stability Board is a consequence of the 2008 financial crisis. And this is a board that was set up by, that was decided by the G20, and that was set up by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And the function of the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, is to monitor financial instability at the world level and to send out warning signals to state regulators about the building of imbalance, but at the world level. And that did not exist before. Okay, there was no monitoring of the global imbalances. The change also that comes at this point is that we moved gradually from transnational activities to global markets. What's the main difference? The main difference is the intensity of the exchange. When you are in transnational activities, it means that you are, for example, a French firm and you engage heavily into cross-border contracts. Moving from transnational activities to global markets means that as a French firm today, I'm not focusing only on the cross-border aspect. I am focusing on the world market. My strategy is devised from the start, taking into account the global markets, okay, and not just linking different areas of the world. So it's a change in intensity, not necessarily in the instruments or in the tools. And what will change is, of course, the nature of supervision. First of all, self-regulation and deregulation have not been completely abandoned, but they have been really watered down because it has not worked out well. So these are not highly set elements of the agenda anymore. Okay, they are still, they can still be used. Okay, we can use self-regulation, but we've had an evolution, and what has absorbed that is the evolution of compliance. The compliance review has moved from a technical review to a risk management approach, and that's the major difference. Compliance today, of course, rests on technical review of the way you do things, but it also serves another objective, which is to assess the risk, and so to give you the tools to manage the risk. And that is why compliance, sorry, and that is why compliance has become so fundamental, so essential in the financial regulations mode of delivering its supervision. Okay, so that's very, very briefly, it gives you an idea of the time span and of the changes. What I'm really trying to have you really understand and really comprehend is that in the past, of course, we could have gone through a much longer term history. Okay, and you have to realize that when we talk about new products today, new ways of doing things, it's often not totally new. It's always embedded in the past. Okay, to understand the present and to look at the future, you need to master the past, and I think it's very important. But still, they are what we call, breaking points. One of the breaking points in the closer history has been the 1980s. Another breaking point has been the financial crisis, and they have given rise to new approaches, new coherence. All right, so we are, of course, somewhere over here. Okay, we are over the on the timeline. We are somewhere over here. So we are today going to be looking at compliance, corporate governance, and the ethical concerns that are brought with it in a market level focus. It doesn't mean that we are not concerned with the firm level. It's just that the focus is not only and specifically at the firm level, it's more at the market level, and that englobes it encompasses the firm level. And supervision has changed. It has become a major tool, and a tool that is mainly principle based. Okay, and so that's the context that we are going to be in from now on. Now I'll just try to finish this part. I'm going very quickly on the following slide, and you can look at them by yourself. What I've set up on the following 2-3 slides are the elements of what is called a sound policy framework. So your question might be, what's the difference between financial regulation and policy? The difference is that when we talk about regulation, we're talking about the standards, the rules that are created. When we start talking about the policy, we're talking about both the rules, the public policy, the choices that are made by the state, and the practice. So it's, when we talk about a policy framework, it's a much larger view of all the element that structures the activity. It's not just looking at the regulations. Now, a sound policy framework for financial regulation has been, has come out of the 2008 crisis. We live with it today, and basically, and I'll jump to the conclusion. Basically, this is the international consensus that we have on what should the policy framework, or the policy mix, if you want to use another term, should bring forward. What it should bring forward, so the policy objectives, it's that today when we design and we organize the regulation of a given sector, and specifically the financial sector, is that the objectives should correspond to the beneficial outcomes that are anticipated by those different interventions. And what are the beneficial outcomes that we need in order for the financial markets to function well and to be beneficial to the development, growth, and the real economy? First is we need confidence in the financial system. So you need rules that enhance confidence in the financial system. You see the link here with Essex, definitely, because when we talk about confidence, we talk about confidence of the players, so the financial institution, but we're also talking about the confidence of the customers, of the citizens. And so the ethical requirements will play an important role in sustaining and developing such confidence. Systemic stability is important, and that's probably more at the firm level, but systemic stability, and that is going to be implemented through compliance systems, as well as the safety and soundness of financial institutions, very closely linked to systemic stability. But the safety and soundness of financial institution will be implemented here again through compliance and rules. Okay. Market integrity and transparency, market conduct and consumer protection, and efficiency are the policy objectives. So are the outcomes, the targets that all the regulations should try to achieve one way or the other using the tool that we've talked. So there's a great there's a great consensus, international consensus on this. Of course, the details are national, so they'll be different. What this means, and I'll probably end on this point. What this actually means is that financial regulation is, as I told you, one of the key policy instruments. It's not the only one, okay, but it's one of the major elements of the public policies that are put into place. And when we talk about financial regulation, we are talking about all the instrument, all the mechanisms that the state or the agencies or the legislator will make mandatory, will set as a requirement for any organization or individual, okay? And they have to comply with that. So that's financial regulation. But you have to understand and that we will be seeing a lot of examples of that as we go along. Financial regulation, and regulation even generally speaking, can be elaborated through different types of instruments. So there are different type of tools that together, brought together, actually create what we call financial regulations. The policies, the legislations, the decrees. And so this will include rules and principles that, for example, require that you act in a certain way, that you behave in a certain way, or that you refrain from acting in a certain way. So abstention or action. Okay. And those can be rules or principle. It can be a specific rule or it can be just a general principle. Rules and principle that try to direct the behavior of the agents. Okay, that's also a way of bringing forward your financial regulation. Rules that are specifically focusing on the outcomes, on the target. And here, the only way to put this into implementation is through compliance. Okay, so you're familiar, for example, with the Basel rules and the capital requirements. We know that the capital requirement is not a set level, a set watermark for all firms. It's you need to have a certain level of own funds to cover your risk. So it's what you're specifying here is the outcome, but then it is for the private organization to know how they comply with that obligation of reaching a specific outcome. And the rules and regulation are not telling you this is exactly the level of own funds that you should have. I mean, the actual figure, the number of own funds that you should have. So rules that specify outcomes. I insist on this because this is where compliance is the only way to put this into shape and into practice. And finally, of course, your regulation depends and rests heavily on the mechanisms and the system that you are going to resort to in order to implement and enforce all your rules and principles. Now, one of the main mechanisms is compliance. Okay, so those are the elements that are the basics of financial regulation, and they explain why compliance and ethics are such fundamental elements of financial regulation. I think it's about time, probably. Yes, it is about time for you to have your pause. When we come back, we'll just be looking at very quickly at this slide, just to raise your awareness of the relationship between the historical events and the changes and the evolutions in financial regulation. That'll be pretty quick, and then we'll finish off on looking at who are the norm makers, who are the ones that make the rules that we will have to apply, international level or national level. All right, but let's have a pause. I think it's about time for you to grab probably something to eat. I'm sure you're pretty hungry if it's the evening, and so we'll meet in after what a 15-20 minute pause. Okay, and of course, if you have any questions, comment, do not hesitate. All right. So if you have no question, then we'll meet in about 20 minutes, 15-20 minutes. Is that okay? Okay. So see you just after the pause. Oh. Oh, I don't know if you can hear me. Sorry, I'm having difficulties connecting. Now it should be okay. All right. So. It was a bit more complicated. So, is that screen dark? Yes. Okay. So if I put the presentation on full mode, you can't see it. Can you see the the presentation? But I'm not seeing anything. All right. Oh, okay, good. You can see it. Fine. So I was the one that had a hard time seeing it. Okay. Okay, we're back on track. So as I told you, just maybe one element to look at here is this chart here that explains how the convergence actually moved up. Why is it interesting to spend a few quick minutes? Be assured, but on this, because it is a fundamental phenomenon that happens, is that there are radical changes, new ways of doing things, new steps that are taken because of the events that surround us. Now, when you think about this, you realize how the COVID-19 situation, not directly in terms of financial regulation, obviously, but how the events that we've been living through for the past 15 months or so have and will have an impact on regulation at large, on compliance, the content of compliance, on ethics, on business ethics in particular. And so that's why I want to show you the reality of that, because this is something we have to keep in mind if we're trying. I mean, if you're in a business, if you're in a manager, an operational in a business, of course you attend to daily business. I mean, the daily day-to-day business, but you also look forward. You also try to devise strategies, and you also try to grow or to expand or to develop. And so that means that you're looking at the future. Looking at the future is never easy, of course. But there's one thing that you can rely on is the fact that the actual events, always with a little delay, bring about new types of regulation, new types of requirement, new types of policies and policy mix. And so that can help us try to anticipate the future by having that kind of mindset and having that in mind. So if we look back at the international convergence of financial regulation, we realize, if we take a timeline, we realize that the reality of this convergence was actually a consequence of a set of events. Some of these events have been, I would say, global, happened at the level of the world. Others were more localized. If we take a starting point, 1929, the great crisis of 1929, so the financial crisis is only in the US, obviously. Well, actually, it's mainly in the US. The collapse of the stock exchange is in the US, but it's going to spread, of course, also to England and to other parts of the world. But there were not that many major stock exchanges at that time. 1929 is definitely a turning point in terms of financial regulations. Things change, and actually, you could even say that the bulk, the extent, the extensive approach to regulation starts after 1929, because a lot of rules, of norms, and new policies are devised. Whereas before 1929, I'm not saying that before 1929 it was the Wild West, but it was much less regulated. Then a second second crisis takes place, the 1970s, and actually, to be more precise, 1973, the oil crisis. Okay, that triggers a shock, an economic shock to the world. And this first oil crisis has to be also understood in parallel with the fact that in the 1970s, it is a period where transnational financial activities really they really take off. It really starts to increase heavily at that time. And at that time, it's mainly financial globalization or financial internationalization. The globalization that implies goods, companies, and people is gradually going to take more importance in the coming decades after the 1970s. What comes out of that crisis and of that period? Well, there are two things we can highlight. The BCBS, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, actually is created in 1974 as a consequence of the 1973 crisis, oil crisis. Why? Because it is the governors of the central banks that, as a consequence of the economic shock that their economies are taking full front, and because the national banks are going more and more international, they suddenly realize, each of them separately, that they're having difficulties carrying out their mission to supervise the banking activity. And so they decide informally, this is not a decision that was mandated by states. This was not organized by some political will. It is a spontaneous decision of these governors of central banks. The first year, just probably the G10 countries, 10 or 12 countries only. But they got together and they said, we need to discuss about the options that are, at our that we can use in order to meet the new challenges. And that's how they created the prudential regulations. So the capital's requirement initially. It is how they created they laid down the first foundation of a strong international cooperation in matters of financial regulation, okay, through a first set of guidelines on international cooperation of financial supervisors, financial authority supervisors. So you see, it's a consequence. I mean, it's a consequence of the events. Had there not been the oil shock, the crisis, well, maybe the BCBS would never have, taken shape, and probably would not have taken the importance that it has taken. It would not have this fundamental influence that it now has on devising financial regulation. 1997, what we call the Asian financial crisis. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody. The Asian financial crisis. Now, I don't know if you remember that, but it's the collapse of the Thai, the baht, the Thai currency, and it collapses, and with it, it takes a bit like a small tsunami. Well, big for East Asia, but it will remain in Asia. It takes with it all of the Asian economies, and the Korean won is also going to collapse because as a consequence of that. So the Asian financial crisis, which was a very hard crisis for Asia, was contained in Asia. Okay, that's something that, of course, 10 years later did not happen. 10 years later, the collapse of the U.S. financial market was not contained in the U.S. It spread to the global, to the global economy and to the world. The reason for that is probably, and quite certainly, linked to the fact that the Asian economies that suffered that crisis in 1997 might have been global for some of them, not all, but some of them, in terms of commodities, so in terms of trade, but were not yet major financial players. And that is why, as a consequence, the crisis did not spread outside of Asia. And the other reason why it did not spread is also because of the reactions of the states, of course. What came out of that crisis? As I said, nobody saw it coming. This actually triggered a change of mindset. It opened up the eyes of the industrialized countries that suddenly realized that they were not alone in the world, that there were other major economies, some of them emerging economies, but these economies were playing a fundamental role. And so the institutions that existed up till the late 1990s did not take that into account. And one of the issues was that there was no organization, well, there was no group discussion among these now equally important countries. Mind you, the United Nations existed. There were a lot of WTO existed, but not everybody was a member of WTO. But the group discussion at a very high level, the G10, is only with the industrialized country, and those group discussions are very important. Why? Because formal international institutions are very, very big machine. They're not agile. They're important. They're very important in terms of symbol, in terms of institutional existence, but they're not agile institutions. And so you do not have the same type of exchange of talks. You don't talk freely in those organizations. It's very difficult. The high level group meetings, the heads of state or of minister, they enable very free talk, sometimes a bit tough, but very free talk. And they are a good fora in order to tackle common issues and to try to find consensus. And so what came out of the 1997 Asian financial crisis is that suddenly the rest of the world and I mean by that the industrialized nation, so the West plus Japan, realized that we needed to create some kind of club where the major economies could talk and could reach consensus, helpfully reach consensus on major global issues. And that is why, as a consequence of that crisis, the G20 was created. Okay, not just like that overnight. It took a few years. They weren't very clear about how they would do it, but it finally stabilized around the G20. The G20 worked, but did not do much up till 2009. And in 2009, because of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, the G20 suddenly became more than useful. Why? Because in 2009, the members of the G20, confronted with the huge challenges of the financial crisis, made a very solemn declaration saying, we, heads of states of the major economies, and at least large emerging and industrialized or highly industrialized economies, we have to tackle the financial regulation issue at the world level, because we have to avoid an economic catastrophe for the whole world. And so that crisis enabled the G20 to become an important player of financial regulation. And between 2009 and 2013, 14, let's say 14, the G20 played a fundamental role. They were the drivers of all the changes in regulation, because they adopted consensus, not rules. They did not adopt rules because they don't have the power. This is an exchange group. Okay, it's a bit like a global think tank. It's a bit like a global world governance soft law type of organization. And so they do not create rules. They just make declarations by consensus. But then they act nationally. They take measures, formal measures. So it has a huge impact. Okay, to give you an example, all the work that has been carried against what we call tax haven and the imbalances between the tax systems that we've been trying to address for the past, let's say, 10 to 12 years, have been addressed as a consequence of the consensus among the G20 members. So see, it has an impact. Now, I said that it was very active from 2009 to 2013, 14, 15. Why? Well, because it was very active when the events put a huge burden, a huge pressure on states to try to find solutions. As soon as the economy started getting better in different parts of the world, then the pressure to agree, to negotiate, to come to a consensus was less urgent, was less powerful. And so then the G20 maybe receded a bit, was a bit less active, was less on the forefront, and took less initiatives. And then what happened after that, you had the Trump administration in the US, and the Trump administration was very much anti G20 and anti discussions. The actual crisis is probably triggering again a change, and probably the G20 could maybe again tackle issues, especially with the change of administration in the US. That is something to be seen. Anyways, the G20 played an important role. The 2007-2008 crisis had another consequence, is that national regulation was overhauled. And the first huge change in national regulation was the Dodd-Frank Act in the US, or the Save Wall Street Act in the US. But that influenced, or that it didn't influence necessarily, but it was ricocheted in Europe, where there was a major change, in the UK, which is a very important financial center, and the G20 came up with a four-pillar initiative to reform financial regulation. So my point here is just to say that the 2007-2008 events are important because you had, as I said, you had a lot of policy recommendation issued by the Treasury Department in the U.S. for the U.S., but everybody looked at them because it had a lot of impact. In Europe, you had what you call the Larosière report by the EU that also tried to come up with answers to the changes in regulation for financial service. And that same year in the UK, there is the Turner report, okay? And they played an important role, a fundamental role. I should add here now the COVID crisis, COVID-19 crisis, but before that, other events that had an impact, the Brexit and the Trump administration in the US. Okay, so my point here is not to go into details in any of that. It's just to say, you see, these changes of thought, these changes in approach, were imposed or were at least forced by events. And you really have to understand that regulations, policy mix, the way you put and implement compliance, the way you think about ethical questions are totally linked to the world events, the local events, whether historical, whether a catastrophe or not a catastrophe. It can be a change in technology. It can be, and so that is something that as professionals you have to understand in order to be not capable of seeing what will be the future, but in anticipating some evolutions. Right. So I'm not going to go into any details of the content of the Treasury Department's report or the Larosière or the Turner report, but you will find in the slides details of the U.S. reform proposal, as well as the Larosière report with Europe's proposal and the UK proposal. Okay, very, very simply in terms of bullet point. You can look through that. What's interesting, and that's the only thing you have to I'd like to mention at this point. What's interesting is that you do find a lot of common elements in the US reform proposal and in the European one and the UK one. Okay, and that's what's important, is to see how there was some consensus, and that explains why the G20 adopted an agenda for a reform, and there was a great consensus that was resting on a four-pillar reform agenda. And the four-pillar reform agenda, and here again, you have slides after that give details. I'm not going to go into that right now because I see the time is moving. This four-pillar reform agenda is relevant to what we'll be looking at in terms of compliance and other elements. The four-pillar reform agenda rests on, one, a very strong regulatory framework. That implied what? It implied improving or adopting new rules, new norms. Second pillar, effective supervision. So enhancing the role and function of agencies and improving the compliance mechanisms. Third pillar, having a resolution system and addressing systemic institution, the famous too big to fail problem, and having specific tools to address the bankruptcy of financial institutions. Why? Because the crisis had shown that the bankruptcy laws that exist in the different systems are not well designed for the failure of a financial institution, okay? Because it's not quick enough, it's not energetic enough, you cannot isolate and contain the fire of a collapsing financial institution with the traditional bankruptcy or insolvency tools. Okay, so that's what we mean when we talk about resolution mechanism and addressing systemic institutions. Why? Because the major institution, they cause problems that are specific to them, that are not the same from smaller institutions. Once they have a systemic effect, they need to be treated specifically. And that's the famous, as I said, too big to fail syndrome. And the fourth and last pillar, transparent international assessment and peer review. I will not be going into any details of pillar 3 and 4, okay? But that's the agenda that was taken. What we're interested in, compliance and ethics, takes place in pillar 1 and 2 of the G20's agenda, and explain why it has become so important in today's world. Okay, so I think this is very important to understand. So you see how, coming back to what I was pinpointing, we have here an event, the financial crisis of 2007-2008, that triggers a set of reforms reports. And these end up by giving content, giving substance to a global agenda that is put forward by the G20. So you see how all these things fit in, and as a consequence, we live today in a world that has many, many more or major changes. Sorry, that have experienced major changes in both the contents of the rules and the way you put them forward, and that justifies what I was saying. That justifies the importance of compliance, and by extension of the ethical aspect. So I'm just realizing that we've been online for quite some time already, and I know this is probably not easy to follow. Here again, a lot of information. I'm just checking if I should I start the new. No, I think it's I'll tell you what. I think it's a bit late to start. We'll start again tomorrow on the part on the policymakers. So I'll just give a few words, and we'll finish it. End up a little earlier this evening. I'll just say a few words about the content of the G20's agenda, because that is the agenda that has set the actual system that we live in. So the first pillar that imposes a strong, well, that calls, doesn't impose. Remember, the G20 cannot impose. It recommends. It is a very strong suggestion. So the first aspect was to strengthen the regulatory framework. There are two things that can be found in this that were very new. One of them is let's say the improvement, to amend the Basel Capital Framework that you're familiar with. That implied improving the prudential regulations. Why? Because before that, the 2007-2008 financial crisis, these prudential regulations were mainly, if not exclusively, applied to banks. What the financial crisis has shown was that, well, there are a lot of other financial institutions that should be also subject to prudential regulation. So improving prudential regulations, and this is where obviously the compliance system is going to play, the technical compliance is going to play an important aspect, and also to come up with counter-cyclical frameworks. You know, this idea that when markets are growing in a bull market, then you should put more capital aside to anticipate a return, the moment when the market will go downhill. Okay, and so that in period of growth, you should build reserves. Okay, you should prepare yourself for period of famine or periods that are more complicated. And so the counter-cyclical framework that what is also called capital buffers came up with at that time. Now here again, that has an impact on compliance. The other aspect, enhancing supervisory arrangements so that they would become much more effective. This is where one of the pillars of the three pillars in Basel, in the Basel Agreement, is going to become much more important. It's the pillar that is related to supervision, and of course to also the corporate governance aspect. Now this is really important, because enhancing supervisory arrangements so that they would become more effective. This is what really developed compliance and the deployment of compliance within organization and specific corporate governance within financial institution. Okay, so that's the effective supervision is really fundamental, and it's in that context that we will then move on. Not tomorrow, but after tomorrow. So on Friday, that we will be moving on to ethics and compliance. Okay, in that specific context. The last two aspects of the agenda, of the G20's agenda, as I told you, I'm not going to talk about it much because we're not going to be going into that. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but so there was this this pillar that consists of extending the reach of financial regulation so as to be sure that all systemically important institutions were covered by the regulations. So the too big to fail aspects, which creates moral hazard, having a resolution regime, I just talked about it, so having a specific financial bankruptcy regime, and finally, coming up with solutions to avoid regulatory arbitrage. What is a regulatory arbitrage? That's an interesting phenomenon. A regulatory arbitrage is when a multinational, and that is true for finance, but it is also true, probably to different extent, but it's also true in other industries. It's when a multinational, because it is a multinational, can actually decide where it is going to locate legally its activities or its headquarters or its operation, or how it's going to split that so that it benefits from the rules that it will consider as the ones that have the less constraint, as the ones that would be the most favorable for its own operations. And so regulatory arbitrage is something that raises concerns for states because it enables firms to escape from some of the legal or regulatory requirements, and that can also weaken the efficiency of regulation. Now, of course, as long as there is no international coordination, it's very hard to avoid regulatory arbitrage. Okay, but that's an issue because it weakens the regulatory answers. It weakens the policy mix. There is one debate today I'm sure you're familiar with, and we'll not go into details, but it's an example of this regulatory arbitrage that can have problem. It's the debate today regarding the taxations of the new tech, the internet giants, okay, the what we call the GAFAMs, the Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and those kind. We know that these companies, because of the nature of their trade, tend to escape very easily local taxation, and that is creating a real issue for states, for all states. Why? Because they can actually engage into fiscal regulatory arbitrage. Okay, so that's the phenomenon that I'm talking about, and that is important. And that explains why many of the talks about how do we implement compliance, what do we put into compliance, has increasingly been done with an international convergence, because it's the only way for that compliance to be really effective and to really deliver. Okay, so that's explains the situation. And finally, the transparent international assessment and peer review. I will not go into any details here, because we will not be seeing it later on. So I'm just telling you what it is. It's this idea that since finance, or as people in New York would say, since finance is globalized, there needs to be much more exchange at the international level between the regulators, between the legislators, between the private and professional organization. And remember, we saw that how financial regulation is an extensive concept. Well, this pillar of the G20's agenda was clearly to try to coordinate accounting standards globally, because they have a direct role, to try to work towards a greater coordination of cross-jurisdictional issues. Basically, if you have a multinational firm that has, I don't know, a lawsuit in one country, this might have consequences in others. So national jurisdiction should cooperate or should coordinate better, because it's the only way to be efficient. Also, trying to have peer review of national regulation. So basically what this means is that, for example, the French financial regulation is going to be reviewed by people coming from another country. And so they'll write a report saying, well, these are our findings. Okay, we have assessed your regulation. And that's this idea to promote cooperation, to get people from different countries to know each other better. I mean, the people working in finance, of course, and overviewing finance. And the last part, which is, of course, fundamental to what we'll see, is to have better practice. And how do you go along having better practice? Well, you draft reports and reports on the best practices regarding risk management, regarding corporate governance. So that means that the literature is overwhelming, which is the downside effect. But the positive side is that there are lots of best practice that are circulating, that are exchanged, and it's difficult to ignore them. It's difficult to not know them, which is a good thing. The downside here is when some people, and I talked about it the other day, when some people thought that, oh, because this is a best practice in New York, and New York has this tradition of being an efficient financial marketplace, we copy that. That would be a mistake. And I think that a lot of the policymakers today are aware of that. You should not copy, but you should understand these best practices to see how, if and how they might be useful to consider for you in your case. Not copied, maybe adapted, but at least it's food for thought. And that's the world we live in. And that is why the ethical aspects and not only the compliance, but the ethical aspect have taken a lot of importance, because they also feed on this exchange of information on the what we call the best practices. All right, so that's the framework. So far, we've seen all the different. I mean, we've seen different bits and pieces, and I hope it's starting to make sense in terms of why do we see all these different elements, and we're going to narrow our scope and our talk, of course, to ethics and compliance. But before we get there, we still have to look at a last, more institutional aspect. Who designs the norms, both nationally and internationally? And so that's the last part of this first part on rules and regulations. But we need to take a bit of time on that, not the whole session, but a bit of time. So we're not going to start that tonight for you, late afternoon for me. We'll look at that tomorrow. We'll start by that tomorrow, and we'll move on to the concept of ethics behind. Okay, so are there any questions? Oui, je vous en prie. Are there any questions or not? And if not, I guess this has been an intense session again. Merci beaucoup. Sorry, there's somebody in my office. All right, so if there are no questions, and you can always come up with questions tomorrow about what we've talked today. If you sleep over it, you might have a new question mark that will appear. So if there are no questions, I think we'll call it a day here for today, and we'll meet tomorrow and we'll pick it up where we stopped on who designed norms and standards, and then we'll be moving on to ethics and the concepts of ethics. Good night to all, and see you tomorrow.